Digital 410 Productions proudly presents the What's the Scuttlebutt podcast with your hosts Dodd Abernathy, Jeff Copsetta, and Henry Sledge.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the What's the Scuttlebutt podcast, your favorite World War II-based podcast. And we are back again tonight with a special guest, but I think it'd be more than suiting to allow our friend Henry Sledge to introduce our guest. Go ahead, Henry.
Well, I'm really proud and excited to introduce our friend John McManus from the Missouri University of Science and Technology. And John's an author of numerous books on military history, but his latest book is Island Infernos, which, John, I believe that just came out, correct?
It did. It came out about a month ago, Henry.
Okay, excellent. Well, it's on my Christmas list along with Fire and Fortitude, and probably the one you did on the 110th, Alamo and the Ardennes. Mm-hmm. But anyway, I'm really happy to have you in because, I mean, you've got three guys here who are huge fans of your work. I know Don just finished your book, September Hope.
Absolutely. Fantastic book. I got some questions for you about it a little bit later, but we'll get to that in due time.
So, then I just finished Americans at Normandy, and right before that, Americans at D-Day.
And Jeff is currently working on one of your books, correct, Jeff?
Yeah, I really. Deadly Sky. I was saying before we went on the air, that's not the only book I've got from you, sir. I did pick up Fire and Fortitude about a year ago when we first got to work together. I haven't got to it yet, but I was telling these guys, you know, if you don't read any books but one about the air war in the Second World War, you can be very savvy on the topic by reading just your Deadly Sky, because it just covers, to me, it covers every aspect without going into too much eye-bleeding detail and statistics and data. It's a great flowing book, and it's just all-encompassing. You know, it's just incredible. And I pointed out to them about the some of the praise that you got from guys like Donald L. Miller and Gerald Astor, and their books, Masters of the Air and The Mighty Eighth, respectively, I read right after yours, just almost in succession. So just well done, sir. I just wanted to tell you that. Just well done. Thank you for doing it and continuing to do it, because like Don said, and you know, we're just three guys that are just like-minded and love your work. And just very thankful to have you here on our show and to talk about it.
Well, I really appreciate it. It made my night. Thank you so much. Thank you.
And one of the things I want to point out, too, for the listening audience, if you're not familiar with McManus's work, one, shame on you. But two, your writing style, it takes all the homework out. You do not feel like you're sitting in history class. I mean, which is not a bad thing if you're listening to this podcast, but there's a lot of people who are still working their way into, you know, getting into leisure reading. For the younger listeners out there, your reading style is fantastic. It's informative. You feel like you're right there, especially September Hope. I'm reading this stuff, and I guess, you know, get a little bit out the gate. One of the first questions I have, which Henry brought up, which we haven't talked about, but he kind of introed it, and clearly he's thinking the same thing I did. When it comes to your researching for these books, it seems like you have access to great diaries, first-person accounts. Is it just you, or do you have a team?
No, it's just me.
Wow.
I do almost all of my research at Missouri S&T. We have a history undergraduate program, you know, so you can get a bachelor's degree in history, but we do not have a graduate program. So I don't have graduate students doing anything like that. And I mean, with a tiny exception of a few sort of administrative details here and there, like I did a book called Grunts, Inside the American Infantry Combat Experience, World War II through Iraq. And I had a student at that time, an undergraduate student, who helped line up some photo research for me. But with the exception of that, I do pretty much all of it because I mean, I love doing it, and I like having control over it too. I guess I'm kind of a control freak in that regard. So everything that goes into these books, I want to make sure that I know where it came from, that you know, that I've been able to verify it so much as is possible. And, you know, so it's maybe a quality control thing too, but I just like to work that way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that just blows me away, the level of first-person accounts that you get in these books. Jeff and Henry and I were discussing it a while back when we were doing Operation Market Garden. And, you know, just from the little bit of reading that and knowledge that we had prior to me reading your book, there's so much about Operation Market Garden that we didn't know about, and so the amount of information and documentation, first person accounts that you uncovered is just tremendous. And I learned so much more about that operation in September Hope. And that was like the first question. I was like, he's got to have a whole crew of people researching this stuff because there's just so much of it there. So that's just a testament to your passion for the topic and the subject matter.
Yeah, I mean, for me, when I approach a topic, I guess I'm kind of an immersion historian. I really like to chase down every last source that I think could be relevant or interesting for whatever the scope of whatever I'm covering. One of the things that kind of led me in this direction is that it's, I think like all of you guys was very interested in World War II from an early age. And it just seemed like when we were kids that a lot of the books out there didn't give you much a sense of what it was like for the average soldier, whether in combat or otherwise. And that was a little bit frustrating for me in the sense of wanting to understand the war better. And of course, as I grew a little older, I knew, so many veterans too, because we were very fortunate, obviously, to know so many World War II veterans. And I really decided if I'm going to do this kind of work, that it kind of needs to be in that direction of understanding something of what that might have been like, at least from a literary point of view. And so September Hope, what I found was that there were just so many incredible sources that either hadn't been used or were underused, or maybe not fully understood in the context of other sources and other accounts that might round out the stories a little bit or whatever it would be. And so I really hope to give the reader a kind of a narrative sense of, okay, here's what's going on, here's the objective of all this, and here's how these various people fit within it, and here's what happens to them, and here's why it's significant in the end. And so what had led me to the topic initially was that, like all of you, I'm sure you read the incredible book, A Bridge Too Far, and Cornelius Ryan.
Right.
I mean, I just can't rave on about him enough. It's just an incredible foundational historian. And yet, Bridge Too Far is a pretty big scope. And I think there were sort of two gaps in it. One, I think the American airborne experience was really not explored as fully as it could be. And two, I think it overlooked a little bit, maybe by necessity, the Scheldt estuary and the sort of how that's a kind of linked story with Market Garden. And so I thought, well, maybe there would be, a book in there for me, because I don't pretend to be an international historian, who could tell you precisely what's happening, on the Eastern Front or something or whatever. But I can, I think, as an American trained historian, give you a good sense of the American soldier. And I thought that maybe I could create a book with that scope that also showed you what happens to the Scheldt Estuary campaign, which is a direct consequence of the failure of Market Garden, October, November 1944. So that I thought that maybe that could round out the picture a little bit.
And the other thing that I appreciated, which I'm sure the family members did too, is you really shined a spotlight on the contribution of the glider riders. People think Operation Market Garden, it was all just guys jumping out of planes. But as you pointed out, actually, most of the forces came in via glider after the initial landings.
That was one of my favorite parts of the research for that book is just, it was an education for me. Because in Deadly Sky, I was mainly talking about the power pilots and the crews and not as much the glider pilots. And so it was a little bit of an eye-opener for me, and a good one, that to get into that world with the glider pilots. And when I did the research for September Hope, it's been about, 10, 11, 12 years ago, there were still a pretty decent number of glider pilots around. And so I kind of got immersed in their world and got all these amazing accounts, and had all this correspondence and stories that I didn't think had been told. And also, of course, I wanted to give the perspective of, the soldiers who went in on gliders too, and how important their role was in Market Garden as well. Because I think all of us certainly tend to focus on the paratroopers, and that's fine. But I think that the glider side of it kind of rounds it out too.
When you're researching the gliders, were you kind of as surprised as I was as a reader to find out that when it came to a co-pilot, they just simply looked and said, "Hey, you can tie a good knot on your tie. Come up here. Let me train you something."
It was just so mind-blowing. You always think, these minutely planned military operations and every provision and contingency, and then it's like, oh, wait, grab this guy and he'll be the co-pilot or whatever. But, in a way, it didn't surprise me because I'd studied enough combat history by then to know just what a shoestring it often is. Well, one of the things that really stood out to me with the glider pilots, as aviators, of course, they had a great deal of pride, as they should, but they felt like mavericks. They felt like outcasts who had been underestimated. I understand why, but it was such a stark contrast to me with the way the British are going to train and use their glider pilots versus the Americans. The British, are going to turn these guys into infantrymen once they're on the ground, because they got a premium on manpower. They can't just squander guys. On the American side, you have this kind of sort of administrative competition between the Army Air Forces and then, the ground forces. And the Army Air Forces, of course, think the glider pilots are theirs, and so they're really only trained for that. And once they're on the ground, they're kind of these wayward souls wandering around, doing some things that are productive, other things that aren't. And I found this letter by General Gavin, the commander of the 82nd Airborne Division, sort of really in-depth assessing the glider pilots and how they ought to be dealt with in the future. And his sort of the main gist of his message was, once these guys are on the ground, they're more trouble than they're worth, And I thought that was just so hilarious, because he was talking about how they were sort of making trouble, not really always premeditated, but just by being in the way, sort of. And I thought that was a very American thing, in the sense of being able to kind of squander this manpower, but also having trained it so proficiently. And then the co-pilots as these, sort of shoestring guys doing the best they can. And that was pretty darn good, actually, considering what was going on. I just think it's amazing. And
kind of to what you're saying about the pilots, especially when it comes to Operation Market Garden, the logistics are already on a shoestring. Now you have these guys, now you got to find ways to get them back. Oh, now we need jeeps or a troop carrier that's already being occupied to do something else. We have to round these guys up. Technically, it's our job is to get them back. It's like, that's just one more thing to have to worry about.
It really was. It was so chaotic, too.
Yeah.
And a lot of them are cut off. A lot of them don't want to go back.
They want their
glory. They like just exploring what's going on the ground and finding food and laying low, or some alcohol or whatever. And some of them want to fight. Some of them want to fight with the infantry. But even those, and it's the majority really who do want to get back, it's a lot easier said than done, because of the chaos of the operation, too.
One more thing I would just want to cover on this book, and then I'll let Henry talk about some of the books he just read. For those of you listening, you're a casual observer, maybe you're just getting into history, you're probably overwhelmingly familiar with Band of Brothers. There's an episode in Band of Brothers called The Island, and that's the one where Webster and Tom Hanks' son comes, and they want to go take a shower, and Malarkey says, "How long has it been since you've had a shower, Webster?" You get into that island, quote-unquote, island campaign, that part of Market Garden, in great in-depth in here. And you talk about the living conditions, the fact that a lot of these guys have a shower once in a month and a half, 2 months, and how during the daytime they can't come out of their holes for fear of being hit with artillery and things like that. And so for those of you listening, if you're familiar with that episode of Band of Brothers and you really want to get some in-depth of what those living conditions are like, that is covered in great detail in September Hope.
Yeah, what I did is I split the book up into two parts. One called The Leap, which is all about the airborne operation and that sort of what I call September Hope, that week-long operation in which they hope to get across the Rhine bridges at Arnhem and go into northern Germany and all that. And obviously, that fails. But what I think what we sometimes tend to overlook is what happens for the next almost 2 months. As these units are basically in place in static warfare for the most part, and they're suffering the same amount of casualties. So it's interesting because the casualty rates in the two U.S. airborne divisions are almost exactly equal from that first 1 week phase, what I called the leap, and then the second part of the book is called the fall, which is sort of a double entendre in the sense that you've fallen away from this mission that failed, and it's the fall. And they are, these two U.S. airborne divisions are not designed for that kind of static frontline infantry duty, and yet they have to be pressed into that service to hold the line. And it's some pretty lousy conditions. They're living in foxholes, many of them. And as you mentioned, Don, it's like, a lot of them couldn't get out of their holes. They certainly couldn't bathe. There's small unit actions going on and off. And they're just melting away with casualties. And the weather's getting worse. And it's a very demoralizing circumstance, and I think it's well portrayed in that episode of Band of Brothers. The conditions, of course, the Easy Company was a big part of that fight on the island, and it was called the island because it's low ground surrounded by all these, all this water, and it's there's this sort of levee type berm, that is their world. And it's interesting because you go to that area today, around Ophoisden, places like that. I mean, it's really, the terrain is more or less the same, so you really do get a sense of this kind of confining environment of low ground and a kind of a watery place to be. And you can imagine in the fall how raw that would be and how moist. So this is not what a paratrooper signed up for.
Well, it was really interesting reading Babe Heffron and Bill Garnier's book. They talk about, obviously, everywhere that they were from the night they dropped in all the way through the end of the campaign. And they talk about Holland. I mean, the people welcome them back every year. It was like such a feeling of warmth and involvement with the people who were there. And like the people would have pictures of them that their ancestors had taken of the guys, during World War II. And I mean, it just blew Garnier away. I mean, far and away eclipsed, Bastogne or any of the other areas.
And it's a microcosm for the American experience in Holland that fall. There is seldom an American soldier who would have served in that campaign, and also in the Scheldt among the 104th Infantry Division, that would have a cross word to say about the Dutch. Right there. I mean, of course, I think there was a friendship between the two nations before this, but I think there was a very, very strong bond after that, especially in that area. That Market Garden corridor is a very special place, and I have to confess to being very biased because I have felt the same thing. I love it there. We ride on the coattails of these guys who really did fighting. All we did was get born, as Americans, but yet we're treated like kings practically when we're there, and who wouldn't like that? So I think a lot of the American soldiers at that time felt there were a lot of cultural similarities. They could relate to the Dutch. The Dutch were very excited about their liberation, they hoped. Sure. And instead, it turns in, their homes turn into a battleground that fall. And it was a very difficult winter for the Dutch, on the front lines near this fighting, but also, of course, more significantly, for those who were still in German-occupied territory in what was called the Hunger Winter, in which about 10,000 Dutch died. So I tried to, in September Hope, I tried to give that flavor of the local side of this too, and how the locals viewed the Americans and vice versa, and how you see that kind of bond begin. I really think it's just a really compelling story.
One of the things you pointed out too, we were talking about using the airborne for static positions, and I don't think anybody really ever thinks about it, and you so eloquently pointed it out, I think, through a firsthand account from someone's diary entry or complaint. Airborne troopers, as you said, getting casualty rates at the same as an infantry soldier, when so much more time, energy, and effort goes into training these guys, they can't get replacements as quick as an infantry division can because of the amount of time it takes to train them in all their special operations. And that's why they're really not meant for static defensive positions. They're hit and move on.
Yeah, it's the profound irony of the whole thing. I mean, these airborne units have been created, for these kind of quick dash operations, which we anticipated we have, and we did from Sicily onward. And yet every time the airborne units were used for that mission, they're not really designed for. You saw it in Normandy, you saw it in Holland, and of course, obviously, famously in the Battle of the Bulge, when they're both fed in. And I think it's remarkable how well they do in the Battle of the Bulge when you consider they've been in their rest area for all of a week, maybe, or 2 weeks, whatever it was, not very long, and then they're just thrown into the mix near Verbemont in Saint-Vith in the case of the 82nd Airborne Division, and obviously Bastogne for the 101st. And so, you see them used for these missions they were never designed for, and then it was going to continue after the Bulge too. In which you basically see them go into Germany alongside the rest of the army. So it had to be a bit frustrating for a paratrooper, because if there's one thing you would hope for when you're trained as a paratrooper is that, yes, you're going to be in dangerous missions, but it's not going to last that long. Yeah. Because they're supposed to relieve you when you're behind enemy lines, right. And it didn't always happen.
I think that goes back to what you said earlier, and I really appreciated minutely planned military operations, because as a former soldier myself, being downrange, I know firsthand everything can be perfectly planned, and then whoop, are they shooting at us? Okay, let's go. It goes out the window every time. But I really find it fascinating. Kind of going back to your writing style a little bit, I wanted to kind of point out from a reenactor standpoint. I've learned that, and I think a lot of reenactors are the same way, that you really kind of get into whatever you're trying to portray by better getting into what would be surrounding the person there, not necessarily knowing everything about the battle, because let's face it, anybody who fought at Bastogne had no idea from a tactical standpoint. They couldn't have drawn stuff out on a map. Maybe, some of the higher end NCOs and officers that, kind of really had a grasp prior to going there. But your general issue, G.I. Joe, going in there with M1 Garand, he didn't know where the heck he was at most of the time. He was just trying to stay alive. And I find that out, even myself firsthand. People told me about the stuff, the operations I was a part of in Baghdad. I mean, yeah, sure. I guess that's what we were doing, But so I never really thought of that from your perspective as an author, to really, really engross yourself in that. And again, I think from a reenactor, it's the same way. What was entertainment like? What you start listening to the music, you start learning about the actors and actresses. You get into what brand of cigarettes and, so on and so on, to really kind of delve in to what it would have been like back then. So that's really interesting. And it obviously just is apparent in every page that you have penned, because it, like Don said, it's like you're there, and it's a very obvious style that you have, and it's very, very appreciated.
Yeah, to me, that's what's compelling is, if somehow you can feel like you're there as much as you ever can reading a book, that somehow this wakes up for you, and you feel like you're sort of part of this or immersed in it. And I think the way to do that is just to have these everyday perspectives of the people who are part of it, and the emotions I think that they're expressing, because I think that's what we can all relate to. Even
Absolutely.
if you know what I mean, even if not all of us are cold in a foxhole or something like that, or we're living comfortable lives, we can certainly relate to fear and and hunger or envy or apprehension, whatever it would be, anger, all these things that a lot of these soldiers experience. And so that's what I try to convey, is how they were viewing things at the time.
Yeah, absolutely. And even just thinking in any sense, sometimes a song will take somebody back, or a certain aroma, like, oh man, it's like grandma's cookies around Christmas time, So it's the same thing, it's the same thing for those guys. I'm sure that there were certain things, there was a certain sound, not necessarily tree bursts, but there were certain things that took them back, and that was all part of their experience, all part of what they did over there. So that's really interesting. That's just a really neat perspective.
Yeah, and I think for people getting into history and World War II, a lot of people think before they really dive into books that all these books are just going to be logistics, dates, history. But when you read authors like you and the style of writing you do, me personally, I'm all about the first person accounts, even if it's written through a third person view. To me, it's so much more relatable and intriguing if I can think, wow, this, with the writing style that you have, it really brings home wow, this really happened to real people, not, okay, on this date this happened, we moved a bunch of people here and this happened. To me, I'm really into
John
the
does a really
first-hand
good
account.
job of melding that first person account with the larger context, so you're understanding what's going on in an operation like Market Garden or D-Day at Normandy.
Yeah, it's like anything,
go ahead, sir.
Yeah, I mean, it's like anything. There's always some objective. There's always some purpose that people are working toward, I guess. And I guess as we go higher up the chain, the purpose tends to be mission fulfillment and carrying out their plan or whatever. As we go lower down the chain, the purpose seems to be survival, comfort, warmth, getting food, or whatever it is. But we can all relate to that at a very human level. And that's, I guess, really what interests me as an historian is people, and as an American historian in particular, what interests me is Americans and what makes us tick and who we are and what these folks were like and whether we can relate to some aspects or not, what we can learn from that, and that's like we were talking about with the logistics and the cold hard data and all that kind of stuff. I mean, that's where as a kid, it was a little frustrating for me because it seemed like a lot of books were written from that angle, and it's just the human beings seem to be lost somehow. And so it occurred to me, it was like, well, the human story should be in there, but we can also understand the larger logistical story when we look at human beings through that lens. And so if we know that, the market garden takes X number of hundreds of thousands of tons of supplies, it's like, okay, yeah, that's interesting to know. But what does that mean then? What did that mean for those who had to carry them in? Or, was it enough? Or what was the context of all that? Was it planned well? How did it play out? What were the problems? And so now you really start to unravel the larger story. And I think then it gets interesting.
Yeah, that's, like I said, that's something we talked about a few times on this podcast is, Don likes a lot of the memoirs, the first person stuff. And I tended to gravitate more towards some of the other, I want to know the battle. I want to learn about the battle, from the 20,000 foot level. And then I'll go into the memoir stuff, because you're not going to learn anything from the battle in a memoir. A lot, and vice versa. You're not really going to learn about the human experience from the tactical standpoint. You blend that perfectly. You make it to where, you can understand the human experience and you can also get a concept from the tactical level, as if you're looking at a map with a bunch of red and blue arrows, and that's key to understanding it. So
it is key to understanding it. Yeah. And I appreciate it. To me, it's again wrapped up in that larger purpose of why are they there, and what does that mean then for the average guy, or the person who has to fight that battle, the person who has to plan it, the person who has to command it. These are all the various things that kind of come into play. And what I've learned over the years, and I don't think I really knew this as well, 20 some odd years ago, is that the generals are human too, in the sense that we can see human stories through them too. It's just they're preoccupied with different things, and so I think a lot of we can relate to that too, of having to make difficult decisions and having to make being in a leadership quandary, where to place yourself on the battlefield, for instance, and why, and how to deal with people, and so I think all of that becomes very, very relatable.
We talked a little bit earlier about your research process. Do you find it's a little bit more taxing, or do you have to take a different strategy when you go from like a European theater operations book to a Pacific theater operations book, such as, Fire and Fortitude or Islands Inferno, maybe because there's less coverage or things like that? Do you kind of have to change your game plan up a little bit?
A little bit, but one of the things that attracts me to any topic is if there's a rich amount of source material that really allows us to delve into it. If there isn't, history follows where the sources are. Unfortunately, right. If there isn't much, it's tough to tell that story. You can't just make it up. And if you look at the source material too, you have to kind of parse it out as to, sort of like the firsthand accounts. What is this person in a position really to tell us about, and what are they not? So if we're talking about, a guy in the middle of Battle of Saipan as a private soldier or rifleman, you could certainly tell us this perspective of what it means to be fighting to the death against the Japanese, or dealing with the conditions, or whatever else is going on, what it's like to eat the sea rations or whatever. I don't know that he can tell us a lot about the conflict between the two Generals Smith. Or what Nimitz is doing at that point, or how war production factors into it. And sometimes I've noticed, especially as the years go on, as veterans read more and more of this kind of stuff, they start to kind of pontificate on that too, and then that becomes a little more problematic. So you respectfully kind of parse out, but on the other hand too, if we're looking at say an S4 supply officer logistical report, that person can tell us about their challenges and what was going on that month for their unit, but they don't necessarily, they can't tell you much about what it was to be so fearful as a rifleman at the front. So one of the reasons I approached the Pacific series is I knew there was just a ton of material out there, and a lot of which just hadn't been used the way it could or should. And I felt that if there was any real gap in in our understanding of the U.S. in World War II, it was in the Army story. This is really a huge army that fights in the Pacific. This is 1.8 million American ground soldiers third largest army we've ever sent overseas to fight a war. And yet it's kind of anonymous. And so that very much excited me to kind of delve into that, because I knew there would be an embarrassment of source riches, and that's usually a good thing.
As much as I love reading about the ETO, obviously the Pacific is near and dear to my heart, but like you were talking about a lot of these issues on Paul Woodadge's show, and it got me to thinking, and totally respectfully, I mean, sure, the Marines garner a huge amount of press. They always have. But really, when you look at the sheer scope and numbers of Army operations, there's really not much of a comparison in just terms of sheer weight of numbers. So from that standpoint, I mean, I'm really looking forward to diving into your Army series. But I mean, I have to say, you really jump between ETO and PTO, it seems, with complete ease.
Well, I hope so. I appreciate that. I don't know if it felt that way as I was doing it, but I appreciate that it looked like that. I mean, I'd been building up toward this for a while, and one of the things that kind of led me toward it was that book Grunts that I mentioned, in which I looked at two Pacific theater battles in a great deal of depth. One was the Battle of Guam, which I felt that the Americans fought that battle very well, and the Japanese not so well, because they had kind of given into their own cultural vanity and tendency, through banzai charges and all that were really very counterproductive. But we also saw there, too, how the Marines and the Army worked very well together at Guam. Peleliu, the opposite, in the sense of General Rupertus not wanting the Army there. And because of that, I think a lot of really good Marines suffered for that and suffered and died. And of course, Peleliu was a very tough battle in which the Japanese had figured out the inland defense, and the Americans decide we got to take every cave and nook and cranny. And so, I found those two battles very interesting from that standpoint, as that kind of comparison. And then I realized there was, of course, a much larger scope to the story. And so what I really hope, Henry especially, is that as people read Fire and Fortitude and Island Infernos, then in a way they develop an even greater respect for the Marine Corps, in the sense that there's so few Marines really involved relative to the number of soldiers.
Sure, that's true.
And it's incredible, the level of valor and the impact that the Marine Corps has. And one of the things that I will argue, probably in perpetuity, is that Marines and soldiers in the Pacific tended to fight very well together. And they tended to have a tremendous bond when they interacted with one another. They had respect at the basic rifleman level, typically. And where there were problems, it was usually not doctrinal problems, as I think sometimes we tend to think. It was usually command problems. And what I mean by that is General Holland Smith on Saipan is just a guy who doesn't want the Army there. And he doesn't want him part of the team, and he's just not acting like a commander. And the same thing with Rupertus.
It's the hubris that gets in the way.
It is. It's just self-defeating. It's very frustrating me as an historian. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was just you talk about Smith and Julian Smith and Hal and Mad Smith, and I know things have been written about the 27th Division, and isn't it on Saipan when there's a lot of tension because General Smith doesn't think they're pushing hard enough and fast enough, and so the Marines are going too far forward in the 27th. I mean, do you feel like the 27th kind of got short shrifted there, or do you think that's a legit assessment?
I think the 27th definitely got short shrifted, and I think that the 27th generally fought very well, and I think that most Marines who fought alongside them would agree with that. The 27th had really, at that point, if we're talking like 4 or 5 days into the battle, 27th had the toughest mission of driving into the middle of the Japanese defenses on the highest ground. The Marines were moving in the valleys on either side, kind of enveloping, and not as if it was an easy mission. It wasn't. But when the 27th took over for the Marines who had been fighting in the middle, the Marine battalion commander, whose unit had been taking the lead, he told the Army commander, he said, "This is the toughest fight we've ever been in. You're inheriting one hell of a fight here." And so he was telling him straight out, and that's precisely what the Army found too. So all the frontal attacks in the world, of valor and all that, wasn't going to do anything for you. It was going to take using the noggin of combined arms and incremental and all that kind of stuff. And I don't care whether you're a Marine or a soldier, physics govern you, and ballistics and all that. And so I think that both Marines and soldiers were fighting pretty similarly. As someone who studied a lot of like combat history of World War II, I didn't find that much difference in how they actually fought at Saipan. The difference is Holland Smith is just has such a Marine-centric view of the world and kind of just hates the other services, not just the Army, but the Navy, that he doesn't really think of himself as the commander of all these divisions that are his troops. He thinks of my Marines and then the 27th Division. And that's a big problem. And so he conflicts with Ralph Smith, the 27th Division commander. It's really quite sad because Ralph Smith was a fine commander, but Holland Smith is just not troubling himself to go to the front actually and, see what's going on for himself. And so I'm afraid he doesn't emerge as a very sympathetic figure in Island Infernos because I can't help but be frustrated and maybe a little angry that I think that he's willing to kind of spend lives for his own ignorance. And I'm talking Marine lives too, and soldier lives. And the other thing that kind of irks me about him a little bit, he liked to present himself as this sort of big, rough, tough, gruff Marine, and the soldiers weren't up to his toughness or whatever. Well, Holland Smith had never been through boot camp. He did not go to the Naval Academy. He basically got commissioned without going to OCS. He basically had a Marine commission handed to him, and he was a good Marine. And he was a good amphibious operational thinker, but he had hardly seen a lick of combat. And he tried to present himself as this big, tough combat guy who the soldiers didn't measure up or something. Well, all his Marines have been through boot camp or the Naval Academy or OCS, and that was pretty rough, and Holland Smith hadn't earned that kind of persona, in my view. And he certainly hadn't faced anywhere near as much combat as Ralph Smith, who had fought in World War I and had such strong ties to France that his wife was French. And Ralph Smith, on the very day that Holland Smith fires him, Ralph Smith spent the day at the front lines and almost got killed multiple times. So it struck me as sort of sad and unjust that Ralph Smith was impugned by a man who really didn't even go to the front lines throughout much of any of the battle, and yet was willing to kind of call out the Army soldiers as cowards. And that rubs me the wrong way.
Do you think his persona, if you will, is kind of a little bit of overcompensation for that lack of training and experience?
I definitely think it was, yes. And I think it's so regrettable because I think if he'd had a bit more modesty about it or not defensiveness or whatever, he was a smart man and he understood a great deal, probably more than almost any other American general, about amphibious warfare. But I'm not saying he's a coward. I'm trying to not portray that at all, but I am saying he didn't have whatever it took to go to the front lines and check on the situation for himself. He just gave into his own predispositions and biases. And yes, I think there was a bit of overcompensation there. He loved to have that Marine identity and persona. Who wouldn't? And yet he didn't really earn it. And I just don't think I don't think he served his Marines well in that regard. And I certainly don't think he served the soldiers well. So you see this direct contrast between Holland Smith and Major General Roy Geiger, who's in command at Guam. And Geiger, by contrast, who of course is a Marine general and a remarkable aviator, yes. He views everybody in his amphibious corps as being under his command, whether Marines or soldiers. He doesn't care. And that's what matters to him. And so you see a much smoother command structure and a much smoother battle fought there. Granted, the Japanese garrison wasn't quite as potent, but it still was pretty formidable. And then later on at Peleliu, he has to step in, Geiger does, to basically tell Rupertus, you're going to work with the Army. And if there's one mistake Geiger makes, it's that he waited 2 or 3 days, too long to make that happen. And unfortunately, a lot of people died in the meantime.
I know that, and I try to minimize how much I talk about my father, but I can't. In this case, I have to refer to it directly to what you said, John. I just did a reread of my dad's book, and I'm researching some of his papers for a project. and I read some other things that he wrote that nobody's ever seen. And the things he says about the Army, it's heartwarming. I mean, to what you said right there, I mean, he said, sure, there was inter-service rivalry, but you better bet your ass we were glad to see the doggies because we'd had all we could take. I mean, we saw those guys, and he talks about how he looked at them and nodded, and they nodded back. And he said, I felt mutual respect and admiration.
That is really interesting to hear, Henry. I mean, that, as you know, obviously, I've been an incredible admirer of your father for a long period of time, and his memoir was seminal for me, absolutely seminal. As for, of course, Get in Line, tens of thousands of others. Sure. It's the most amazing war memoir I think ever written, and it had a great effect and impact on me. So for him to say that, I think, is much more meaningful than anything I could say. When you're looking at his 5th Marine Regiment, how hard they're fighting around the Uber Brogal by the time the 81st Division gets there. And, and the 1st Marines had been destroyed for the most part. The 5th Marines weren't too far from that.
Right.
It was, yeah, absolutely. And, I did a lot of research, of course, on Marine firsthand accounts for grunts and also for Island Infernos. And I never saw anybody this side of Rupertus who didn't want the Army there. I mean, who wouldn't want the help?
Oh, absolutely. And, the 1st Marine Tank Battalion was pulled off of Peleliu. Was it after 1 week or 2?
I think it's at least 1. Yeah.
Because when they push up into the Horseshoe, it's 710th Tank Battalion.
Absolutely.
That's who 3 Five's working with. And again, I read where, there was a lot of respect, a lot of really good teamwork.
Yeah, and that's a pattern you see throughout the war. A lot of times you have Marine units working with Army tank battalions at other islands too, including Saipan. And they generally are working very well together. And of course, there's all sorts of jostling, and there's all sorts of little snide remarks. And the Marines tend to be younger. That's one thing, especially the Marines are younger generally than a lot of the Army combat units. So I think there's a little difference in perspective there too. The Marines certainly more aggressive in some ways, but at the same time, combat troops are combat troops, And so one of the things I say about Rupertus in Peleliu is that he's the only high-level commander I can think of who actually didn't want reinforcements. And, that when you think about that or wrap your mind around it, you're like, what in the world is this guy thinking? And I think it comes down to that kind of, that sort of kind of institutional chauvinism in a way. And part of it was because the Marine Corps was smallest of the services. It tended to be under assault budget-wise and constantly had to stand up for itself. And I think it's very understandable from that perspective. But from the command perspective, it's really unfortunate.
For sure.
I'm just marveling at this dialogue right now because it's obviously as a soldier, I've always had to kind of defend what the Army did, in the Pacific, because, like you say, I mean, the Marines kind of had the PR in their back pocket. It seems like for the entire campaign, and I'm loving it.
I never. Sure, my dad was he opinionated as a Marine? Of course he was.
Of course,
I grew up hearing it, but I mean, I was asked on a recent podcast, Henry, did your dad ever talk about his opinion of the general we were just referring to? And I said, yeah, he did. And I didn't say another word. And I didn't want to say another word because I just didn't want to throw things out there that would just be counterproductive. And plus, General Rupertus's granddaughter is a friend of mine on Facebook. Okay, so he was a man who served his country with distinction. I don't want to besmirch that. But if you're asking me, did Sledgehammer express strong opinions? His opinions were the same as all his other buddies who needed reinforcements.
Absolutely. They needed it. And they knew it. I mean, they understood what was going on. They're in the middle of this mess. They're losing their buddies.
Sure.
And, in Rupertus, as with anybody that I write about, and especially in this series, I tried to be empathetic or sympathetic to them and fair to them. Rupertus, had suffered a terrible tragedy earlier in his life of having, I think, 2 of his kids and his wife die of
Yes.
scarlet fever, I think it was, in China.
Correct.
I mean, I don't know that he was ever the same after that. And he was certainly dedicated. He
I
wrote the
can't even
Rifleman's
imagine.
Creed. He wrote the Rifleman's Creed. He
Right.
he was second in command to in Guadalcanal, and it performed very well, but he just was not a division commander. And the other thing too, Rupertus died in 1945 of a heart condition, and so I kind of have always wondered if maybe that was a factor too, that maybe he just wasn't in very good health, and then maybe that affected him as well. I don't know. It's just speculation.
I've always felt like it did. Just my personal opinion from talking to my dad and reading other things, that everything I get my hands on, I felt like it did. I think Peleliu just taxed him in so many ways, as it did, everybody. So
for sure, and he was older than most everybody there, and that could not have been easy. Plus, he had a broken ankle, of course, too.
That's right. Yeah,
that'd be rough, and that restricted his mobility, and I think restricted his vision in the sense of knowing what was going on. Because ordinarily, I think he probably would have been at the front, getting a little better feel for things.
Right.
So it was a bit unfortunate in that regard too.
Earlier, you were talking about I don't want to say lack of, but the smaller unit of Marines on the islands comparative to the Army. And when you said that, I had a quick thought in my mind. I was like, oh, it's almost like they're special forces. Then I had an even quicker thought, oh, that makes sense of why they felt that they really didn't need the Marine Raiders, because the Marines were basically could do the same type of thing. And the Marine infantry brass was getting upset that the Marine Raiders are taking their best guys and putting them in these Raider units. So let's just get rid of the Raiders unit, stop with the training, bring them back into the regular Corps, and let us just do the same job. And it makes perfect sense now once you made that comparison with the fewer Marines, comparatively speaking, to the Army that was out there doing that type of work.
Yeah, and there's always this tension in the Marine Corps. Should we have, special operations troops or not? Aren't all Marines, in that vein anyway? And of course, no Marine commander wants to lose his best people to a Raider unit and all that. So yeah, you definitely see that tension play out in World War II. It's generally won by the conventionalist for the most part, especially by 1944 and 45 when the biggest battles are fought. But the interesting thing about the Marine units is they're pretty much designed to be, amphibious light infantry, and their companies are overstrength by Army standards. Most go into the invasions with about, I think, 235, something like that, in a rifle company, whereas an Army company is about 183, 183 or something like that. But they also, just like the paratroopers in Europe, end up in sustained fights like Peleliu, like Okinawa, Iwo Jima. I mean, the list goes on. And the casualty rates are just staggering. I mean, it's just beyond belief. And so when you end up, from my sort of 20,000 foot viewpoint, especially looking through an Army lens, the 6 Marine divisions are part of this larger American ground complement. You add 21 Army divisions, plus really probably 3 or 4 divisions worth of combat manpower with regimental combat teams and engineer special brigades, tank battalions, and all that, probably at least that. And you're looking at 30 plus, very, very powerful ground combat units. And so the Marines are just sort of one part of that mix. And maybe that's what I'm hoping to kind of, revise maybe the viewpoint a little bit. I think there's a tendency when we look back on the Pacific War to say, okay, well, it was, I guess it was Guadalcanal, then it was Tarawa, then it was Saipan, and then it was Iwo and Okinawa. And it's like, well, no, actually the Philippines was the nexus of the American war in the Pacific.
Now, are you
huge campaigns?
Are you going to do a study on Manila and the Army in the Philippines? Is that in the works?
Yeah, well, in the 3rd volume, we'll see that play out.
Excellent.
Yeah, so the scope of Island Infernos is just 1944. So the book ends with the Battle of Leyte, which, by the way, is a huge battle. Leyte, the American complement at Leyte in terms of ground combat divisions and naval strength is larger than the American contribution to the Normandy invasion, believe it or not.
Wow.
It's staggering to step back and think of that. And of course, this is all Army, in terms of the ground forces, except for there are some Marine aviation units that go in and fight as part of the Battle of Leyte, but not, in ground combat. So Island Infernos ends with that. And then the next volume, the 3rd and last volume, covers 1945. And Henry, absolutely, Manila is a huge part of that. It's an enormous battle. It's so costly and it's incredibly tragic. And it is so complex and multi-layered that I take it on a great deal of depth.
I'm glad to hear that, because actually on Paul's show, I saw James Scott talking about Rampage. And I'm intrigued. Army operations, 1945, because, Guadalcanal and obviously Peleliu for me. I mean, I've read so much about that. But you get into 1945, except for Okinawa, I'm sadly ignorant, for example, about the Philippines.
Me too.
I've read a little bit about the marine aviation stuff there, but I was intrigued by Rampage, and I thought I wanted to read it. And then, he and Paul started talking about how the civilian population suffered under Japanese atrocities and barbarity. And I'm just thinking, man, I don't know if I can do that.
It is not going to be pleasant reading. It is going to be rough reading. Henry, I would venture to say it's going to be as rough a reading as reading your father's Okinawa account, because the tragedy on so many
Probably
levels and the
worse.
civilian component, maybe worse in the sense it's a big metropolitan area, I guess, but similar in the sense of just the horrific tragedy and scope and scale of this. So, by the way, Rampage is an incredible book. I highly recommend that book. James is an incredible writer, and he's done a remarkable research job. That is the best single book on the Battle of Manila, and especially from the civilian point of view of what happens there. My account is going to happen in this larger context, of course, of the Army story in 1945, but the Army's campaign in the Philippines, which is, of course, again, just enormous. MacArthur's command by Leyte is the second largest American theater on the globe, behind only Eisenhower in Europe. MacArthur's got 14 plus divisions going at this stage, and and it's going to grow. And of course, it was ultimately culminating toward the possible invasion of Japan. So you can imagine how large that was going to be of eventually 3 field armies, 6th, 8th, and 10th. What's happening in the Philippines is fascinating to study from a kind of guerrilla war level, but also conventional operations, amphibious, aviation, political conditions, human discourse. Like when the Army goes into Manila, and into the Philippines as a whole, now all of a sudden we have venereal disease problems again, whereas we didn't. We of course didn't at Peleliu. That bad as it was, we didn't have to worry about that. So you're starting to see the kind of nature of the war change, and engineering too. Engineering and logistics is such a huge part of that. But what's really cool to study is all the different islands that they're going to invade, especially as 1945 unfolds. And you see, for instance, Lieutenant General Robert Eichelberger, whom I would argue is probably the best American ground commander who most of us have never heard of in the war.
Now, he had done heavy duty in New Guinea, correct?
Oh, my gosh, yeah. The Battle of Buna in 1942 is just remarkable.
Right.
He was there. He wins the first American ground victory in World War II, and yet we kind of tend to forget that. And so by 3 years later, there he is in the Philippines, in practically invading an island every other day. He has 35 amphibious invasions in a matter of a couple of months. So as an Army commander, as the 8th Army commander, so you kind of see that unfold too. But the problem with it, with the Philippines story in 44, 45, it's kind of similar to the European theater in the sense that, if you really wanted to examine every divisions fight and every small unit action, you'd be studying this forever. And so there's a tendency of repeating. And so the challenge is in how to present this fairly, but without just sort of battering the reader with constant repeated small unit actions that have a sameness about them, So I try and strike that balance, but I think maybe that's why some historians have shied away, just in the sense that they shied away from everything that's going on the French front in the fall of 1944. You tend to parcel it out in small parts of it, like us with Market Garden or maybe Hurtgen Forest or something. If you're taking on that whole big gulp, that's a lot to deal with.
This may be an opinionated question, but as far as mainstream history goes, what do you think is the most overlooked campaign in the PTO as far as mainstream history goes?
Yeah, I really think it's the second Philippines campaign in 44 and 45. This is, in my view, one of the most important campaigns fought in American history. It's an enormous campaign in terms of the number of Americans involved, hundreds of thousands. The combined arms operations of naval and ground power and the air power that's involved in this, the sophistication of it, the intel side of it, working with local guerrillas, which is, of course, vitally important. And the Philippines is, in my view, kind of the nexus of the American war against Japan. I mean, what had happened in 41-42 with the Japanese, I won't even say taking over the archipelago, but ejecting the American armies and capturing, of course, many thousands of Americans and Filipinos, was a profound tragedy. And of course, many Americans wanted to avenge that and liberate the archipelago. And I really think this is sort of, certainly from MacArthur's viewpoint, this is the capstone of the war. And of course, you'd say, well, you ought to be getting to Japan. That's where you really ought to go. And that's a very good argument. And obviously that's Nimitz's argument. And that's what you have these two prongs, Southwest Pacific and Central Pacific. And that's great. But if we're looking at really what happens in the Philippines and the impact it has, I just think it's incredibly overlooked. I know of no book at all that just covers that campaign, 44 and 45. I know pieces of it, a book on Leyte, for instance, or a book on Manila or whatever, but all of it, no. And of course, I don't pretend that I covered it all, but I hope that I gave you a pretty good flavor of it, of what the Army's doing there in 44 and Island Infernos, and then in the next book in 45.
Now, when will that book come out?
I don't know yet. It's mostly written because, believe it or not, originally this was going to be a 2-volume series, and so the second volume was going to be 44 and 45, but that would have ended up as like a 1,200-page book. It would have been a massive doorstop. So unfortunately, my editor and my publisher quite rightly said, let's split that up into 2 volumes. I said, great, because I didn't want to just cut things that needed to be in there. So 44 and 45 were the obvious sort of dividing points, because I had organized the book that way anyway. So most of it is written, but I don't know when it'll be out. Probably not for a couple of years, I think, but that's just total speculation.
Okay. Gives us something to look forward to.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you.
You had a question, Jeff?
I'm really glad you mentioned what you did about Leyte, because I can tell you I was just trying to do the math. It was 20 years and 1 month ago that I was assigned to the 1st Cavalry Division. And, I'd known just a little bit from childhood, 1st Cav, I think, in Vietnam. But, there's a slogan that's still being used, is First Team. And it's not necessarily just because it's the 1st Cavalry Division, but it was 1st Unit Leyte, 1st in the Pyongyang, 1st, so it has a strong legacy. And I was a little disappointed kind of growing up. More, I guess maybe most kids are geared more towards the ETO, as a kid, Battle of the Bulge kind of stuff, but I was very interested and intrigued by the air war in the Pacific. I mean, there's nothing better than Hellcats taking off of a carrier in the middle of a beautiful Pacific sunrise, right?
Right.
But I'll admit, I remember looking back like, okay, what did my unit do in World War II? And I was like, what? They were in the Pacific? Only Marines were in the Pacific. What the heck is this?
That's exactly how I wrote these books. Exactly.
So it was really interesting. And I don't claim to know a whole lot about what the 1st Cav did then, but I do know it was very significant. And just that little bit of research, it really was like, wow, that's interesting. So I'm really glad you said that. Well, before we wrap up, I just wanted to say that I hope our listeners, after they go to WTSPWorldWar2.com and buy a couple T-shirts, I really hope that they buy 2 of your books, one for themselves and one for a friend this Christmas, because I mean, we could go on and on. We've only covered 2 or 3 of the books that you have been. Oh my gosh, we'd be up all night, I think. But
and more.
This has just been incredible for me as just a young historian myself. I started my undergrad in history in February with aspirations to be a high school history teacher here, where I graduated. I've done just about everything else. I think now I'm going to finally settle down and teach American history. But
awesome.
It's just really been a pleasure. Last year when we did that webinar together, I didn't really get to speak. It was not about me, of course. This was you. I was just hosting, and so I was really looking forward to tonight to just just being able to sit back with it and listen to, your perspective on things. And just like Henry said, like 4 guys hanging around a campfire kind of thing, talking about what we're doing. It's just been awesome. It's just been really great.
Really has. And I just want to say before we finish up, Jeff, and you'll like this, I hope. The 1st Cavalry Division is a major player in the Pacific and in Island Infernos, and it will be in Volume 3 too, because 1st Cavalry Division it gets in theater like by early 1944, and it's just like itching for action. And they get the invasion of Los Negros, which is also overlooked, February 1944, but was really important for accelerating the timetable war. And then, of course, they invade Leyte and are a big part of the invasion at Tacloban and then through Leyte. And, of course, and you'll see in Volume 3, they're the liberators of Manila and the POWs in Manila. And so it's an amazing history. And I have a lot on that unit. I think you're going to like that.
Outstanding.
Before we wrap it up, I want to throw you a quick curveball. The U.S. Military History for Dummies. Did they reach out to you to write that book? How did that come about?
A colleague of mine, Kurt Peeler from Florida State University, I think had been thinking about writing it or something, and I don't know, maybe he couldn't, and so he put them in touch with me. Them being the publisher, John Wiley and Sons, and they said, "Would you be interested in doing this?" And I foolishly said yes. And the reason I say foolishly is I didn't know how much work it was going to be.
Yeah, because you got to condense all that down to a short book. This entire military history. It's not Vietnam or Civil War. It's the entire history from the date it published to the start of it.
It's everything. And so, yeah, exactly. For someone as verbose as I am and who likes to get as deep dive into history as it was, I won't say frustrating, but a little challenging in that regard. But the neat part, too, was all the little asides you could put in there, little factoids, the stories, and the top 10 lists and all that. I ended up really enjoying it. But it was a different kind of writing. I've almost thought about using it. I teach a class called the American Military Experience, but I would never want my students to think that I'm calling them dummies, So for that purpose, I've never really gone down that road.
I wonder if they've sat around and said, okay, it's 2021. Do we need to change the name of the franchise just a little bit to make it a little softer?
I know.
Because...
I've wondered the same.
Yeah. Well,
I've got a final question for you, John. What's your favorite film about World War II? Favorite war movie?
I'll be the sort of cliche guy. I just love Saving Private Ryan. I think it's an amazing film on so many levels. Now, there are some things that are wrong, that are inaccurate or whatever. And there's, I think there's a gratuitous swipe at Montgomery and all that. I mean, of course, I admit all that. That's fine. But I think certainly in terms of a kind of seminal portrayal of combat, of the combat soldier's mentality, of leadership dilemmas, the mission versus the man and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
The flavor and feel of Normandy. Unlike most people, some of my favorite scenes are the town fighting. Like when they're supposedly in Neuville-la-Plaine, and there's like sort of about a third of the way into the movie, and it's where the sniper shoots Vin Diesel and all that. I just think that's so well done because of the rain and the masonry and the French involved. And then, of course, the climactic fighting, too. And some of it's Hollywood where the planes come to save the day and all that, too. But yet most of the characters die, and that doesn't always happen in Hollywood movies. And I think that was a little more true to form. So I I really do, after all these years, still think it's brilliant on many levels. And I know it's a bit of it. It's like saying the Beatles are your favorite band, I guess. But if they are, they are, right? So, I really like that movie.
You bring up some good points, and I'll admit that I every time I watch it, I get more scared at the end of the movie in Rommel or wherever they're at, that town. And maybe because I guess urban fighting is a little bit more up my alley, but as opposed to beach landing. But I still, man, when those guys are running 30 cals and ammo everywhere, even before it starts, you hear the tigers and panzers screeching a couple blocks away. That still gets
you hear those treads grinding on the pavement.
Yeah, just to kind of, you just know it's point of no return. As much as that beach invasion was just like god awful, I wouldn't want to be in a 2-story bombed out rock building with a 30 cal and a couple cans of ammo.
I thought that last scene, I'm with you, Jeff. To me, that was way better than the beginning.
Yeah, that gets you.
I think John
was amazing. and having to displace your machine gun. I mean, just something like that, which is so accurate to small unit actions in World War II, especially in Normandy.
I will say I have yet to see sticky bomb in the Army manual. I have not been able to find it in the chat.
It isn't in the manual, but it did exist in reality, in terms of real small unit. And so did believe it or not, so did the arming the 60 millimeter mortar rounds. Because I knew a lot of people at the time who said, "Oh, that's BS, that's Hollywood." Actually, I found a number of accounts where people did that.
Right. Now, throwing them 75 yards, maybe not. But
probably not that far. You'd have to be, who would say, like pretty much any major league pitcher now who can throw about 105, I guess. You'd have to be that,
Well, and as we've also pointed out on this podcast, go ahead and try to pull the pin out of a grenade with your teeth. See how many teeth you spit out along with that pin.
Not many. Right.
You spit more teeth than you will pins. It's John C. McManus. Please head over to johncmcmanus.com. And as Jeff said, head over to WTSPWorldWar2.com. Please sign up for Patreon. It helps, goes a long way. And buy some T-shirts. John, where can people find you on social media? Do you have any pages you frequent, whether it's Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, the like?
I'm mainly a Facebook guy. In addition to my website, as you mentioned on johncmcmanus.com, I've got a Facebook page by that same name. And I post fairly regularly, and there's a lot of really neat stuff there.
Henry's dog makes a rare appearance. It's usually my pup that's in the screen. What's your dog's name, Henry? You never talked about your pup.
This is Lulu. She's really pretty and not very smart.
That's the way we like them.
Is she a beagle?
She looks like a beagle man.
She is. No, she's a coon dog.
Oh,
she's
really?
all legs and lungs, man. If she gets out, you're not going to catch her.
She's gone.
Yeah.
Well, Jeff, you got anything coming up you want to plug?
Oh, well, we've got an air show in March, but I don't know if I need to plug it right now. Just dressing up when I can and taking pictures with people and spreading the word about our greatest generation is what I do every day, though.
Henry, you're the busiest man on the show. What do you got coming up?
No, I wouldn't say that. Going to be another We Happy Few 506 in January. It'll be about Peleliu. But other than that, man, just what I got going on with you guys.
John, thank you so much for spending your Monday evening with us. We greatly appreciate it. And on behalf of our fans, thank you so much. And on behalf of myself, Jeff Copsetta, Henry Sledge, and once again, John C. McManus, we will talk to you guys next week. Thank you very much. And you guys have a great rest of your week.
This has been a Digital 410 production.